As our next panel comes forward, it's on improving state budgeting practices. William Glasgall from the Volker Alliance and Andrew Abramcyzk, thank you, Andrew, from the Commonwealth Foundation. And as they're coming forward and we're getting new name tags off, I was cued into this book, The Price of Government, Getting the Results We Need in an Age of Permanent Fiscal Crisis by David Osborne and Peter Hutchinson. They did some work on Washington's foray into outcome-based budgeting in the early 2002. And just want to read a quick paragraph in the introduction part. Since the fiscal storm broke, many governments have flailed about grabbing any solution that could keep them afloat for another year. The tidal wave of red ink has triggered accounting gimmicks worthy of Enron, shifting next year's tax revenue into the fiscal year, pushing this year's spending onto next year's books, borrowing against future revenue to pay current costs. And at that time, at least 20 states have sold their huge 30-year tobacco settlement revenues at deep discounts to plug current deficits. A former Congressman, Bill Frenzel, put it, quote, "Politicians have more tricks than the CEO of Enron," end quote. Some government financial officers have even admitted off the record, quote, "If we were in the private sector, we'd be in jail." So with that, we're going to learn some good financial practices and improve our budgets so we do not use those gimmicks that tend to lead us, I think, long-term into more financial troubles rather than dealing with from the outgo. So, gentlemen, Bill, if you want to start us off. Thank you for coming.
Anyway, thank you, Representative Grove. Thank you, members. We appreciate the opportunity to discuss our work with the states, and we're talking today about state budget practices. It's a fairly fat slide deck. I'm not going to go through every slide. I'm leaving them there for your reference. So let's get started. The Volker Alliance, where I'm the head of state and local and senior vice president. The Volker Alliance was launched in 2013 by Paul Volcker, the former Federal Reserve Chairman. I joined right after it began. Our mission is to improve and advance the effective management of government to achieve results that matter to citizens. We're in the financial regulatory space and also in the public service space, especially in workforce issues. I deal with fiscal issues, and my program is the successor to something called the State Budget Crisis Task Force that one of our directors, Dick Ravitch, and Paul Volcker ran in the years immediately following the recession. We've taken it in a slightly different direction, and we're going to talk a little bit about state budget practices and how they apply to California. We have a considerable library, as do our colleagues at Mercatus and Pew and Moody's and everywhere else. We have a considerable library of information for your reference, including a state data lab. We have a lot of data that we don't publish, which is always available to members of the legislature and other interested parties. If you want to contact me, we do conferences and we do individual report cards on the states, which I will review in Pennsylvania's case in a couple of minutes. The research that we do, it's unique. We're a consortium, and we're at the center of a group of 8 public universities around the country, from CUNY in New York all the way out to Berkeley and Utah in the West. We divvy up all the states among them, and in Pennsylvania's case, University of Illinois Chicago is our key school. We always welcome other universities to participate in our work, and we take all the information, normalize it with a group of municipal finance consultants, so that everything is squared away. What we don't do is compare numbers against numbers. We compare practices in the states to look for transparency and, most important, sustainability. One goes hand in hand with the other. I'll deal with that in a second. Dan has gone through a lot of the economic outlook. I just want to point out some of the risks that the states are facing. One, of course, is the possibility of a recession. In the latest Bloomberg survey, about 70 odd economists see a 35% chance of recession in the next 12 months. It's interesting, I just spoke to NASAC, the National Association of Auditors, Controllers, and Treasurers, with Dan. One of us asked for a show of hands of about 200 people in the room, how many of you expect a recession in the next 12 months? Almost every hand went up. So that is not an indicator that there will be one, but it's an indicator that people are thinking of one, which means that you need to prepare. Stress testing, rainy day funds, which we'll deal with later, other techniques. You need to be more prepared than perhaps states were in the last recession, for sure. In general, states are doing very well. We're going into the 11th year, record 11th year of recovery. State general fund spending on average is up about 6%, which is about the historic norm, so that's good. The warning signs are federal budget uncertainty. The budget deficit, federal budget deficit is now approaching $1 trillion. That may signal discretionary spending cuts. The president also said, well, maybe we're thinking about a payroll tax cut, which means Medicaid or Medicare rather, and Social Security will be paid either with debt, or Congress will have to deal with that. So there's a pressure point there. A major pressure point is legacy costs, which are pension and OPEB around the country, as you'll see in a heat map I'll show you shortly. Around the country, legacy costs are still rising even in an economic recovery, so there's pressure in many states. And legacy costs, pensions and OPEB, are battling debt service, Medicaid, infrastructure, K through 12, rainy day funds, all for battling for resources. Infrastructure deferred maintenance, which is something that's very poorly disclosed as far as the cost goes. Pennsylvania is not unique in this regard. Infrastructure deferred maintenance costs may be on the order of $1 trillion. We kind of don't know, and we're doing some work in this area. One thing we do know is that even though municipal bond interest rates are near their lowest levels since JFK was president, states are not borrowing their way to recovery. This is good and this is bad. The good part of it is that we don't see states doing a lot of deficit financing as Connecticut has done, Illinois has done, Kansas has done in the past. The other side of it is there are great opportunities here to finance new infrastructure projects. There's some questions on funding them, but the financing ability is there. Money is very cheap right now. So let's get on to our results. And on one thing about the risks, Dan pointed this out. I think Eileen pointed this out. Fixed costs are perhaps the biggest risk for states. And it's not just Medicaid, it's OPEB, pensions, and debt service together. I borrowed this chart from Gabe Pettick, who was at S&P and now is the legislative analyst in California. And he pointed out that Pennsylvania is, all these costs together amount to about 40% of general fund expenditures. When you have a level that high, Illinois is up there, Vermont is up there. When you have a level that high, the governor and the legislature are almost not just tempted, they're driven to one-time measures to support the budget, because you're constantly scrambling to fill the part of the pot that's not on autopilot. The Government Accountability Office in last year's annual outlook for the states said that this is going to be a problem that's going to stretch out for 50 years. So the reality is, if your budget is on, half your budget is on autopilot, or half your spending is on autopilot, you have to look out because you're going to be doing one-time measures over and over and over again. And that's what we look at. We look at budget forecasting, which is how the states estimate revenues, whether they use a consensus system or not. Budget maneuvers, which is a polite word for budget gimmicks or one-times, but that's we look at the extent states go to balance the budget that way. We look at legacy costs, which I've mentioned. We look at reserve funds, which I'll deal with later in a separate panel. And we look at budget transparency. All the states post their budgets online, thank goodness. However, some states are not very good on disclosing tax expenditures, and most states are terrible on disclosing infrastructure deferred maintenance costs. I'll skip through the principles. we're tough graders. We don't do an overall grade. You can sum the grades up if you want. Paul Volcker didn't like the idea of an overall grade because really there's no such thing as a failed state. Even the most stressed states have some meritorious procedures, and you keep the police cars on the road, the schools are open, and even the AAA rated states, the best states, have some procedures that are not so great. So there are 3 states that got 3 A's apiece in the 5 areas, and those are California, Utah, Idaho, and Tennessee. It's funny that California is in there because a decade ago, California was paying its bills with IOUs. They couldn't pass a budget like Pennsylvania a couple years ago. However, under Jerry Brown, California enacted a number of fiscal reforms, especially in the area of rainy day fund reforms, pension reforms, and unfortunately also pushing costs down onto municipalities, which is a bit of a one-time action. But California has really put a much stronger underpinning under its budget. In the category of states that got D- grades, those are our worst grades. Pennsylvania stands out for budget maneuvers. I think that was reviewed in the last panel. Texas stands out. Texas has reserves beyond most states. However, the Texas legislature has its own idea of how pensions should be funded, and it's different from the actuaries. So Texas is building up pension debt every year. It's not off balance sheet anymore, but it's still a pernicious habit. And legacy costs are really legacy costs, budget forecasting. It's a mixed bag, but you'll see that there are very few states that are really in bad shape. Budget forecasting, the green ones are the good ones. Green and sort of bluish ones are the good ones. They have more durable forecasting procedures and more inclusive forecasting procedures that bring in many inputs rather than just what the governor says is what it should be. Budget maneuvers, you'll see one state stands out as red in our 2016-2018 numbers. Unfortunately, it's Pennsylvania, but you can see it's not the only one. New York makes its pension obligations, but still has serious problems with budget maneuvers. I think the green is also a reflection of the economy improving. Legacy costs, we mentioned that this is the big problem. Red and yellow and orange really dominate the United States. This is a national problem. OPEB is not really funded at all around the country, and pensions are at the official discount rates. Pensions are funded at 68, 69%, just at the state level. So this is an issue that we have to confront. And it's an issue that shows up in our budget rankings. Reserve funds, this is definitely a function of the economy improving. This came before Pennsylvania made its big contribution to the rainy day fund. But I expect that when the economy turns down, when and if that happens, we'll see a lot more yellow and red. Transparency, I mentioned infrastructure. There's only 4 states, California, Alaska, Hawaii, and Tennessee, that do a creditable job of disclosing all of their infrastructure deferred maintenance costs. GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board, is beginning an inquiry into this subject this summer. They took a pass at it once before and really failed in their job. States have a lot of options on how they can report this. Tennessee is probably the one to follow. They have a commission that's been in existence since the 1970s that does an extensive census of what it would cost to bring infrastructure, buildings, roads, sewage plants, everything, what it would cost to bring this back to good working order. They're very transparent. It's the Tennessee Intergovernment Relations Commission or something like that. I can follow up later, but they are really the one to follow. I'm going to look at Pennsylvania just briefly and mention how Pennsylvania stacks up relative to its peers. In 2016, 2018, Pennsylvania is kind of an average, below average state. Our preliminary data for 2019 indicate there's really not going to be any change there. I think as we get into 2020, the rainy day fund contribution will help, but you see that the weaknesses are the ones that are kind of chronic. Budget maneuvers, certainly, and legacy costs. We looked at Pennsylvania individually. Those are a little hard to follow on the screen, but what Pennsylvania doesn't do in forecasting is a consensus revenue forecast. Neither does New Jersey. This gives the governor a great deal of power and really cuts the legislature out. There are some states that are, Georgia has been trying to move in this direction with a lot of pushback from the State House. It's Virginia, on the other hand, has a very inclusive forecasting process. It doesn't guarantee 100% accuracy. That's not the point. What it does guarantee is you can agree on a number for revenues before you go into the big debate on expenditures. It saves a lot of time. Indiana does this by custom rather than by statute, but it's proved very effective. Budget maneuvers we don't really need to go into, except that Pennsylvania stands out for revenue and cost shifting, which indicates you're taking revenue from a future year and bringing it into this year's budget, and vice versa for expenditures. Funding recurring expenditures with debt doesn't necessarily mean you're borrowing, but it can also indicate internal borrowing, and it can indicate using things like upfront premiums on financing transactions as cash for the budget. States use cash budgeting, so any source of cash is fair game. Only one large government in the United States uses GAAP for budgeting, and that's New York City. It's part of the price of its rescue in 1975. States should use GAAP for budgeting, but they don't. It's a hard habit to break. We mentioned pension and OPEB funding in the area of reserves. Pennsylvania was doing sort of okay because you had a positive balance, not much in the rainy day fund and some in the surplus. But this year we've seen Pennsylvania, Georgia, Connecticut, New Jersey all increasing their rainy day fund balances by substantial amounts, which is certainly a healthy trend. And we mentioned transparency. I'm just going to mention one other thing that I just in passing. One of you asked a question about Pennsylvania's Medicaid expenditure growth rate relative to other states. I just happened to look at some data this morning that suggested that New York and Connecticut are both growing at about half of Pennsylvania's rate. I'm not quite sure why. I'm not a Medicaid expert, but that's certainly worth further study, as the states are very similar demographically, regionally, and probably this is worth your digging into. And with that, I want to turn it over to Andrew. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to address you this morning on improving state budget practices. My name is Andrew Abramcyzk, and I'm a policy analyst at the Commonwealth Foundation. We are a Pennsylvania-focused research and advocacy organization, and we do our work from a broad perspective of free markets and with an orientation towards personal liberty. The budgetary problems in our state, as we at the Commonwealth Foundation see them, are that the state operating budget is growing too fast, and that the administration frequently overspends even that budget. A lot of very good facts and charts have already been presented. I'll speak a little bit from more of a high-level first principles perspective and with an eye towards some legislative solutions. Spending out of the major revenue funds grew 2.3% per year on average over the past 5 years. And we estimate the sustainable growth rate for total spending was closer to 1.5%. That's $1 billion spending difference over a 5-year period. We estimate the sustainable spending growth rate is the sum of inflation and population growth. If spending is growing faster than the sum of those two numbers, it means that the government's share of the economy is growing. Government programs can't outgrow the economy on which they depend, or taxes eventually have to go up. The most important recommendation I have for you this morning is to pass the Taxpayer Protection Act, Senate Bill 116, House Bill 1316, or TPA, which would encode the sustainable spending growth rate into law as an annual legal limit on the growth rate of spending out of the general fund. If the TPA had been in place over the past 15 years, that would have totaled more than $10,000 of savings for every family of four in the state. Now, given a hard limit on the growth of government at the top line, we would have some hard choices to make. The two charts in my packet illustrate the problem. And if you don't have them in front of you, that's okay, I'll tell you what they say. Figure 1 simply divides up the pie. And as you can see, half of all state spending, at least spending out of the major revenue funds, is what's been called EDS and MEDS, K-12, education, and Medicaid. And if you add, so that's two things that take up half the budget. If you add welfare, police, and corrections, you're at 3/4 of all spending. 5 items makes up 3/4. My second chart shows you the growth rates of those big areas. And what you see is that the biggest areas are also the fastest growing areas. Clearly then, the growth of the government can't change if the growth of these big few items doesn't change. Obviously, things like K-12, Medicaid, corrections, these are not the politically easiest areas to address, but doing so is the only way that the budget growth can be brought under control and that TPA limit can be reached. My colleagues at Commonwealth have written up plenty of specifics in each of those areas, and I'd be happy to elaborate in the question time. So in addition to the arithmetic argument behind a spending limit, there's also a good governance argument. The legislature ought to be making thoughtful trade-offs about where taxpayer dollars are spent. You know, do we want to spend another dollar on pre-K or another dollar on state parks? Do we want to send more money to Penn State or more money to prisons? Is $48,000 per inmate per year, is that the right price for keeping someone locked up? This is the logic that a household or a business uses when they are writing a budget, but it's not always clear that that's how we approach spending decisions in Harrisburg. The situation seems to be, it's too long been that kind of everything grows at the same time. Consequently, the top number grows without limit, and then, oh, we need more revenue. TPA forces choices. I'll turn now from how to limit the growth of the budget to how to keep from overspending once the budgets we enact. In the fiscal year just ended, June 30th, the administration overspent by $673 million, mostly in the area of human services, where it appeared clear that they had under-budgeted up front. That is to say, this wasn't necessarily a mistake. There was simply spending in violation of the balanced budget amendment. There wasn't a lot of press or accountability or transparency about this. A supplemental appropriation for that amount to cover the spending was simply tucked into the appropriations bill for this year. And the trick only worked because we had some extra revenue. Tax revenue, as you know, came in higher than expected this year. But there doesn't appear to have been a backup plan if that hadn't happened. In order to introduce some visibility and potential accountability around that, the Commonwealth Foundation agrees with the ideas put forth by Senator Phillips-Hill and Representative Grove to pursue a constitutional amendment requiring any supplemental spending be voted on separately in a standalone appropriation, not simply hidden in the omnibus legislation for the next year. This would make budget overruns more visible, and frankly, it would put everyone on record as either saying yes or no to them. An important reform already passed in this year's administrative code bill requires any year-end supplemental appropriation to include an explanation of why it happened, why it's needed, and a planned remedy for the future. But I would note that there's no enforcement mechanism, so without that, something like that being contemplated in the future, the effect is unclear. Any kind of requirement that would create more accountability or transparency during the course of the budget year would also be welcome. House Bill 855, which passed the House in June and is now in the Senate Appropriations Committee, would allow for department budgets to be adjusted intra-year if the administration's revenue projections, revenue collections are falling short of projections. This is a good reform to put in place now while revenues are good because, like we talked about, one of the earlier panelists, the economic cycle won't be at the top forever. Lastly, I'd like to touch briefly on off-budget and government-related spending. Spending from the general fund is about $34 billion per year, and all appropriated spending out of the big revenue funds, the general fund, the motor license fund, and the lottery funds, is about $40 billion. That's the number I used to compute the percentages and make the charts that I showed you. But there's actually another $45 billion, a whole other budget effectively, of annual spending that comes out of what we call the shadow budget. It's a set of more than 150 state special funds, often with narrow purposes and dedicated revenue streams, where spending is effectively on autopilot. These include, for example, Public Transportation Trust Fund, the Gaming Fund, Keystone Recreation Parks Conservation Fund, many others, and many more. The shadow budget should not be used to hide spending growth by funding things that ought to be funded out of the general fund. One example I can provide you is that prior to 2016, the state was spending about $95 million annually out of the general fund on the Commonwealth Financing Authority. These payments have been now moved to elsewhere, and general fund spending on the CFA is minimal. But the expense didn't go away. Just because you spent from another pocket that doesn't show up in the general fund, the money is still being spent, and it's still taxpayer money. And also, the general fund's on the hook for any shortfall. So that being said, though, at the same time, we believe there appear to be a lot of resources in these special revenue funds that are being hoarded. The state's cash balances, just to give you a big high-level number, are about $12.5 billion, according to the state treasurer's web dashboard. And we believe that with the exception of a very small reserve, those monies ought to be spent or drawn down or otherwise released before any new revenue sources are tapped or any new borrowing is undertaken. The government should use the resources it has on hand in those special funds and not grab for new ones while it still has billions of dollars in cash. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you both very much. Question one goes to Representative Dawn Kiefer.
Thank you both. So I have two things. First, one that was touched on was the Grove Hill legislation, both the House and Senate, which is specifically to get at that supplemental spending that we have. And they do it constitutionally. Do you see a way that it could be done maybe at the same time, in tandem, as a legislative effort in the, for expediency, and still working the course constitutionally so that you have that as ingrained in our Constitution? Would that be a possibility?
I think so. The thing with a lot of these budgetary measures is that putting them in the Constitution makes them permanent, and you can't move the goalposts later.
Right.
But yes, you're absolutely right that this legislation would have to pass and then be put to the voters, and that makes it a 3-year timeline under the most optimistic scenario.
Right. So I'm just trying to think, right now, while it's heightened and it's fresh in people's minds that, okay, we have this supplemental again, and it's every year. I am relatively new, but it's been every single year. First year coming in with $1.5 billion overspend. So again, if we're in a recession period of time, which, could likely be in the next 2 years, unfortunately, that's not going to be in place to help us with that. The second thing is, and it wasn't really you briefly touched on it, is the hoarding of money that you see sitting there. So the past 3 years in a row, when I've looked on the Treasurer's website, we've been at about $12.5 billion sitting there. And it gets into unlapsed funds, which you didn't touch upon. Pennsylvania's policy on that is pretty loose. I mean, we have something in statute on how those unlapsed funds are supposed to be released and put back in the budget, but we're sitting on, it's always a guesstimate when I ask for what the actual number is on those unlapsed funds. Do you have any other state's policy on that, or something that Pennsylvania should be doing to make sure that, we're not hoarding these dollars, we're addressing those unlapsed funds?
That's a very good detail, and it's important. I would rather get back to you offline on that and get you the proper details on what other states do.
Okay,
with that.
thank you.
Representative,
That was my question.
no, gotcha. Senator Kristen Phillips-Hill.
Great minds think alike. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here today. Wanted to talk to you about the Taxpayer Protection Act and get your input. In calculating what that growth should be, using rate of population growth and rate of growth in the economy, using the GDP, there are often different numbers that are presented to us. There's the Philadelphia GDP, there's the statewide GDP. For purposes of accuracy in our state budgeting, can you talk to which one of those numbers would be the best to use and why?
Well, the good news is, because Pennsylvania is a very big state that looks a lot like the United States itself, the national metrics are very close to Pennsylvania specific. It is actually less important exactly which metric be used than that a metric be used and not changed. But in general, the CPIU for that measures a consumer goods basket for an urban consumer. That's kind of a, so to say, industry standard that's used for a lot of things. And a population growth, of course, is quite easy to measure. The good news is that these different metrics do not differ hugely, but CPIU is what I've used in the calculations.
And remaining stable, using the same metric year over year over year is essential.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Bill, I just want to walk through Pennsylvania's chart a little bit. I like getting A's. I think everybody here wants to get A's moving forward, right? So our first one is budget forecasting, consensus revenue forecasts. And just can you give us a brief description of what some states have adopted to kind of meet that policy goal?
Of course, Representative Grove. Let's look at Virginia, because it's nearby and successful. So in Virginia, the House and the Senate, there's something called they're the money committees, which are the House and the Senate finance committees. They have representatives on a panel. The governor has a representative on the panel, and there's a group of outside business and economic interests who have a representative on the panel. So they'll hash out a number. It's a 2-year. Virginia has a 2-year budget, and they come back and revisit this. So it's well enshrined. Indiana has a very similar process, which is not enshrined in law, but is very deeply buried in custom. So those are two that immediately come to mind. Florida also has a very inclusive forecasting process, and if you'd like, I can get back to you and give you the details on each.
So in general, legislature, governor, plus some independent individuals, business,
In some
public
states, yes,
finance.
and in some states, no.
Bring them together, they analyze the data, kind of try to remove the politics out of it, so you're not, we've unfortunately had some cases here in Pennsylvania where we had inflated revenue
Exactly.
projections to get higher spending, and then, if you don't hit those marks, you automatically create a deficit. So try to remove those budget gimmicks out of the forecasting for the official forecast.
Well, that's the risk is that forecasts get inflated for political reasons. In New Jersey, which has the constitutionally strongest governor in the country, it's an institutional thing. So the governor is very protective of his or her ability to certify revenues. There's been legislation and a proposed constitutional amendment that Senator Sweeney has proposed to instill a consensus system, and the committee would certify the revenue. The governor is unwilling to give up that power. So right now you have the legislature makes a forecast, and the governor makes a forecast. In not this year's budget, but in the previous year's budget, the two sides were arguing about the revenue number in the wee hours before the state was shutting down. I think you probably want to avoid that, because how can you pass an intelligent spending bill if you can't even agree on the numbers? And I know Pennsylvania got into a wrinkle like that a couple of years ago, where you passed two separate bills to make up the budget. Mm-hmm. It's a little more inclusive process in New York State. Texas has a third way, if you will. In Texas, the controller, who is separately elected, separate statutory power, the controller actually prepares the revenue estimate and hands it to the lieutenant governor and the governor. So there it's not a consensus forecast per se, but it's an independent forecast, which the state has to stick to.
Yeah. Budget removers, I'd say we probably need some policy and maybe some culture change within how we do it. Moving on to legacy costs, it looks like our big issue is funded ratio, but OPEB funding, I don't think we really deal with that generally within or have discussions, I don't think, within the General Assembly.
This is partly a phenomenon of what GASB demands in terms of accounting. So GASB says this is a long-term obligation that you as a state or a city or county have. Because it's a long-term obligation, you have to account for that as such. It's a long-term debt. So some states have modest OPEB reserves. Virginia is one of them. But OPEB is essentially a pay-as-you-go contractual issue. So there's it's a real liability from an accounting point of view, but it's one that's much more easily renegotiated than a pension obligation, which in some states has constitutional provisions. Someone mentioned Pennsylvania's local pension issues. As I recall from a couple of years ago when I was a journalist and covering this, Pennsylvania has more pension systems in the state than any other state in America. It's a remarkably inefficient system. It involves lots of extra costs to the municipalities, the districts, the fire districts that have pension systems, and something that really needs to be worked on. Not so much from a benefit point of view, but just a cost and efficiency point of view.
Great. And then the last kind of two are reserves tied to revenue volatility. We'll hit that later in a later panel. And then disclosure of deferred infrastructure replacement costs. Is that transportation or is that capital improvements as well?
This is capital assets.
Okay.
If you look at the federal government, there's an organization called the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board. They've promulgated a set of standards which are baked into law, which federal agencies must use to estimate the cost of deferred maintenance. This is stuff that's, everything from potholes on up, the bridge that you needed to fix. Depreciation is not a very good measure. Depreciation is a concept from the taxable world. So depreciation may or may not show the useful life of a bridge or a sewer plant or the State House, for that matter. So every year the Treasury publishes an annual report on the state of the nation's finances. Buried in there is a chapter on deferred maintenance, agency by agency, which is quite detailed and very useful. States and cities don't follow that standard. They could, but they don't for a variety of reasons. Capital budgets are different from state to state. There's about 40 different capital budgeting systems among the states. In addition, many capital assets are funded by special revenues, tolls, fees, port fees. There's a whole, so they're not part of the general fund. They're often their own world. We're publishing a paper this fall on this that just identifies how it's done and points out some best practices, and we'll follow up on that.
Awesome, thank you. Any other questions? None? Thank you both so much. We really appreciate the testimony, and we'll see you both later in other panels.
Thank you.